Hi class, in this recording we are going to focus on humoral immunity and senescence of the immune lymphatic system. As we look at humoral immunity, it's a very indirect method compared to cellular immunity. It's going to involve releasing antibodies, and then those antibodies target cells for destruction. So when B lymphocytes are stimulated, and these B lymphocytes are a key component of humoral immunity, they will be stimulated to make the antibodies that bind to the antigens and tag those antigens and their associated pathogens for destruction. So cellular immunity can attack the enemy cells directly, whereas humoral immunity focuses on covering enemy cells with antibodies, and then antibody-covered cells are more likely to be destroyed. Humoral immunity works in the same way as cellular immunity, in that there are three stages. We have the recognize and attack, and then memory or remember stage. So as we look at humoral immunity, let's look at recognition. We first need to have some kind of a way of activating the B cells. And those B cells need to recognize their antigen they are designed for. Now, immunocompetent B cells are going to have thousands of receptors on their surface. All of these receptors are going to recognize one specific antigen. And if those antigens bind to the receptors, the antigen and receptors are linked together, and then we have receptor-mediated endocytosis. And then that receptor-mediated endocytosis is going to initiate or be part of this process. It's very small molecules are not antigenic because they can't link across multiple receptors to initiate receptor-mediated endocytosis. Once receptor-mediated endocytosis occurs, the B cell will process or digest the antigen and will spit out some of the epitopes of the antigen onto its MHC2 class 2 proteins, and will start displaying those on the surface using those MHC class 2 proteins. So here we have a B cell, and it's gone through receptor-mediated endocytosis, and now it's going to be displaying an epitope of an antigen using an MHC class 2 protein. And then it can display those epitopes on the surface, and typically this response will stagnate or stall unless a helper T cell gets involved. So the B cell can display that epitope of the antigen to a helper T cell, and this is going to help the formation of the antigen MHC protein complex. The bound T helper cell is then going to release interleukins, and those interleukins activate the B cell. So you can think of it like this, in that the B cell is going to the T cell and saying, hey, look what I found. And the T cell says, oh my gosh, that's a big deal. You should do something about it. And then we'll activate the B cell by releasing interleukins to that B cell. And we've now activated the B cell. Our activated B cell is going to go through clonal selection, where it reproduces again and again. It doubles. And all of those daughter cells are all going to be genetically programmed to attack or respond to that exact same antigen. Overwhelmingly, we get a lot of plasma cells, the cells that produce antibodies, and we'll get to a lesser degree B memory cells. As we look at plasma cells are going to have a lot of rough endoplasmic reticulum. Recall, the rough endoplasmic reticulum produces proteins which are excreted from the cell via exocytosis. And antibodies, or immunoglobulins, are proteins. And these plasma cells are designed to secrete gajillions of antibodies, approximately 2,000 antibodies per second over a 4 or 5 day period of time. So one antibody cell can very easily secrete over 1 billion antibodies. Now, the first exposure to the antigen is going to cause us to make immunoglobulin M antibodies. Subsequent exposures will cause us to make immunoglobulin G antibodies. And these antibodies will only travel in the blood and or other body fluids. So as we look at the antibodies attacking, or the humoral version of attack. The antibodies will bind to that antigen. And the binding of antibodies to the antigen is going to render it harmless. It's a way of making the antigen, or the pathogen rather, impotent. It no longer is able to perform its functions. And it's been tagged for destruction. As we look at the memory of the humoral immune system, some of those B cells will differentiate into memory B cells. And those memory B cells aid with the rapid secondary responses during subsequent exposures to the same antigen. Now, as we look at our antibodies, they can affect our antigens in 4 different ways. We can have agglutination. This is when an immunoglobulin M can bind multiple cells together, causing them to clump together. This binding of multiple enemy cells effectively immobilizes, and it's kind of like taking a bunch of people and handcuffing them all together. Then they can't run away. They really can't function effectively. And now we're going to have enhanced phagocytosis, because instead of the macrophages swallowing one little cell at a time, now macrophages are going to be swallowing multiple cells at the same time. They'll have a nice big bite. Our antibodies also are going to aid with complement fixation. Immunoglobulin M and immunoglobulin G are going to bind to the antigens, change shape, and initiate the complement cascade, which is going to help us with having the membrane attack complexes form. They also can initiate inflammation, stimulate phagocytosis, tag molecules to be removed from circulation when they get to the spleen, so immune clearance, and also enhance cytolysis, which is part of the complement cascade. As we look at these antibodies, they are a primary defense mechanism against foreign bacterial cells or mismatched red blood cells. We also have precipitation. Antibodies can bind antigen molecules, not cells, to create antigen-antibody complexes, which are so large, molecularly speaking, that they are going to fall out of solution and be easily removed by immune clearance in the spleen or phagocytosis via the eosinophils. We also can have neutralization. Antibodies can bind to the pathogenic portions of the antigen, neutralizing the antigen, so the antigen can no longer affect our body in a negative way. Now, during humoral immunity, the primary response, let's go back a slide here. That primary response is the first time we're exposed, the first exposure to the antigen. And we can have antibodies appear 3 to 6 days later. Naive B cells are going to take a while to differentiate into those plasma cells, 3 to 6 days. And then once those plasma cells start to form antibodies, the antibody titer, or antibody blood concentration, goes up. We find first that there's a peak of IgM that peaks 10 days after initial infection and then goes down rapidly. And then we have a peak of immunoglobulin G, which rises, and the immunoglobulin G titer, or concentration, typically will drop off after about a month. So here's a primary response. About 4 or 5 days after initial exposure, we have a peak of immunoglobulin M concentrations, and then once about 6 days after exposure, we start to have the peak of immunoglobulin G concentrations. So this primary response leaves us with an immune memory. We are going to have those memory B cells. And those memory B cells are going to hang out in the germinal centers of our lymph nodes and mount a very quick secondary response for any subsequent exposure. So as we're looking at our subsequent exposure, our secondary response, we have the initial exposure, and the same day, within hours of the re-exposure, we are going to have a skyrocketing concentration of immunoglobulin G and a rising concentration of immunoglobulin M. So instead of waiting a week or 2 weeks for a peak in immunoglobulin concentration, we have it peak in just a couple days. And the response is so rapid that this antigen, whatever the antigen is, has almost no chance to affect our bodies noticeably. And many times, we don't get sick at all. The low levels of immunoglobulin M decline very quickly, but the elevated levels of immunoglobulin G are going to remain elevated in our body for weeks or years, giving us very long-lasting protection. Now, this memory does not last as long in humoral immunity as it does in cellular immunity. So humoral immunity memory B cells don't live as long as memory T cells, but they do last for a very long time. And one of the big questions out there right now is, why do memory cells die, and how can we promote the longevity of our memory cells without booster shots? I don't know the answer to that question, but I guarantee you, if you come up with an answer to that question, you are going to get a Nobel Prize. That's all we have for this recording. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to post them in the class discussion board or shoot me an email. And as always, happy studies.